In 1896, prospectors found gold nuggets in the Yukon. The news triggered a human tsunami as people rushed to the west coast and onto the Klondike. Across the U.S., thousands abandoned their homes for a chance to strike it rich in the northern wilderness. 100,000 people converged on the remote frontier. It was to be the last American gold rush. At the time of the discovery, there had been rumors of gold in the Klondike for decades. In 1878, George Holt had returned from the area with a handful of nuggets. 8 years later, gold was found at 40 Mile Creek, a tributary of the Yukon River. By 1896, a few hundred prospectors were wandering through the area. Now, there is some controversy over who first discovered the gold. One tale is of Skookum Jim and George Carmack pulling gold from Rabbit Creek in 1896. This was after passing a prospector by the name of Robert Henderson. Henderson had bragged that he just staked a gold claim near the Klondike River. The Carmack group drifted further upstream, unsure if Henderson had told the truth. It turned out he had, and the creek was subsequently renamed Bonanza Creek. Another tale actually has Henderson finding the gold first and being late to file his claim, whereby he missed out on the riches. By September, Bonanza Creek was swarming with prospectors. Then, a bigger lode was discovered in nearby El Dorado Creek. Before the month was out, the entire area was staked and in the midst of placer mining. But this turned out to only be a few people, as news had yet to hit the outside world. The true gold rush wouldn't start until the next year, when the early miners, now Klondike Kings, returned to the west coast in ships filled with 2 tons of gold. The news was out, and there was no stopping the tide of humanity, which didn't care that the Yukon was technically Canadian territory. In many ways, the nation was primed for gold fever. The American economy was doing poorly, and not even heading west could alleviate individual suffering. In fact, the economies of the West proved more fragile than those of the East. So when 2 tons of gold came sailing down from the Yukon, it was like a magic cure-all had been handed to the nation. In Seattle, a quarter of the police force quit immediately and booked passage north. The mayor walked out of City Hall, bought a pickaxe, and set off to find a fortune. East Coast bankers were joined by European adventurers. And practically none had any experience in mining, wilderness survival, or incredibly harsh winters. Almost immediately, the first deaths occurred as people were too impatient to wait for the next Yukon steamer, and just bought whatever boats they could get their hands on. Many vessels were not seaworthy. At this stage of the rush, though, these deaths were ignored. By the end of July 1897, the first ships carrying prospectors reached Alaska at Skagway and Delia. For the next 2 years, the Yukon would see more desperation and drama than it had ever seen. As ship followed ship, Skagway grew with tents pitched in close quarters. Little thought was given to sanitation. Crude buildings sprang up with no plan and no inspections. There were fights, murders, and disease. Amidst this, humanity passed through in a screaming, mud-churning mass of desperation to reach the passes over the mountains and trek the 600 miles to Dawson City in the Yukon. Had they known what awaited them, it seems likely many would have already turned back at this point. One pass took you scrambling up nearly 4 miles of sheer ice. So steep was Chilkoot Pass that you had to drag your equipment up piece by piece. During the rush, the mounted police had also stipulated that anyone traveling to the Klondike had to bring 1,000 pounds of supplies, enough to last a year. Due to inexperience in the weather, Chilkoot Pass saw a huge portion of the deaths of the gold rush, by hypothermia, falling, and avalanche. In April 1898, there were 3 avalanches in just 24 hours, killing a total of 70 people. The other route was nicknamed Dead Horse Trail. White Pass, as it is actually named, involved a 2-foot wide pass with a sheer cliff on one side and a 500-foot drop on the other. So many horses fell down that drop that it earned the name Dead Horse Gulch, and one man even claimed to have witnessed a horse commit suicide by walking off the edge. Whichever route you took, you would always end up at Bennett Lake, where you would once again need a boat. And there was no one to sell you one. You had to build it yourself with trees that you cut down. Only a few managed to do this before the winter of 1897 set in. Others were caught along the rivers to Dawson City or at the edge of the lake and forced to camp as the waterways froze over. The result was a miserable camp. Most of the mostly male prospectors lived on bacon, beans, and bread. So in addition to frostbite, they were plagued by scurvy and malnutrition. Finally, in May of 1898, the ice broke. Nearly 2 years after the discovery of gold, the rush finally arrived in Dawson City. Of the 100,000 people who reached Skagway and Dyea, only 40,000 reached the Klondike. The rest either died, stayed in Skagway, or miserably camped at Bennett Lake before being turned away by a new mounted police regulation of allowing only qualified captains manning boats to go to Dawson City. Dawson City itself was now a boom town with a thriving population. There were concert halls, hotels, and even electric lighting, all built since September 1896. It came as a horrible revelation to all of the prospectors. Not a patch of land surrounding the town was unclaimed. The prospectors already in the Yukon when gold was discovered are the ones who profited from the rush, and people like Belinda Mulrooney who built up and owned most of Dawson City. All those who rushed up from America in 1897 were the ones who found themselves penniless on the streets. It's estimated that only 15,000 of the 40,000 who reached Dawson City managed to find gold. Of the 15,000, less than a third made enough to pay for their northern adventure. Even fewer struck it rich. For most prospectors, the Klondike gold rush of 1897 was a brutal lesson in reality. However, just like any boomtown, Dawson City faded away. Gold was soon discovered in Annville and Nome, Alaska. It was enough for some prospectors to rush from the Klondike further north and back into Alaska. In a single week, 8,000 residents left for Nome. By the turn of the century, Dawson City was a near ghost town, not helped by most of it having burnt down. It says something about humanity that so many people were willing to leave jobs, families, and everything they'd ever known for the faintest hope of an overnight fortune. This, when many don't even consider the Klondike to be a true gold rush at all.